Hey guys, I'm Jose and this is tutorial 18, like reading data. Okay, I'm gonna start with tutorial 17. I just renamed this file, it's exactly the previous one, and we're gonna see from this file how to actually read the data that we just exported, right? So I have the folder here of that we created. And if you remember, by pressing any key, we were producing this CSV file. This CSV file contains, if we open it up in numbers, contains the X, Y, and Z coordinates of our points. So while that loads, we're going to start seeing some of the changes that we need to produce here. To actually bring this data, in case we would have a file like this one, like you can see it right now, we can bring this point cloud into processing as well, right? Usually later data comes in this format. It has a few lines before saying the grid has so many units and points are separated by certain amount, and some other information that you could exclude, and then you start reading the data in this fashion, right? So I'm just gonna minimize it for now. So let's see how do we what do we need to do to change this. Let's look through the point class. Won't change at all, right? We will leave it like the way it is. And what we could do right away is that this function here, if key pressed, this was the exporting data information, right? So we can make it a function and bring it out. So void export data, right? And we can pick all this stuff and put it here. So we could say if k pressed. Also, we could add to that if k equals e from export, let's say, right? Just do this action. So we know now that if we press the key E, the data will get exported, right? That's fine. This is the part of the draw where we can are actually calling the function run of all the points. That's fine as well. The main thing that we will change here is our point creation. Like before, we were looking at this line of code that was saying let's make a for loop for columns and a for loop for the rows, and for each one of those entities we would put a point in a grid. Now what we really want to do is just one for loop that would go for from the beginning of the data that we're reading, get the values from that data, and make points out of that. So we're going to delete all this stuff. Actually, it's a good practice to, instead of deleting it, we could just make another function here, void create points, right? So in this way, everything it's kind of modulated in functions, and we know what we're doing. So this creation of points, if we want to call it in the setup, it would be something like that. Functions can get called both in the setup or in the draw. So remembering that here we're just calling them once at the beginning of the script, and then it would be called every frame. So we don't want to create points every frame, right? We just want to create them once. I'm gonna grade that out because I don't want to call this point creation right now. I just sorry. That's the name of the function, right? Okay. So we will leave that function there in case we would want to go back to the original setup. But for now, we're gonna just read the data. So how do we read the data? First of all, we're gonna do a global variable that is a string type. String, I don't know, we've talked about this, but it's a text, right? The data will come in form of a text, and that's really useful because we can do so many operations with text, like break the text, remove characters, remove certain features that we don't want, and just leave the data. And this is really useful if you want to start reading information from the internet. Just taking some information, let's say, from a document that you're interested in, the variables, and not maybe some comments and stuff like that. So that's really useful. So we will call this string data, right? Then we will use, that's the way we declare it. Then we will say data equals load strings, right? So in here we're loading some file, and we will say load the file data slash points dot csv, and this will be under quotation mark. The thing that we have to be careful here is that as we in the previous file we were creating this file, right? So what this line does, it opens an empty file called this name, and then we start writing every line, and then eventually we close it, right? So if we leave this line on and then we try to read this data, the data would be empty because it would override the file that we already have and would replace it with an empty file, and then we will try to read it, right? So we already did that, the exporting data. If you haven't done that tutorial, go to tutorial 17 where we actually export the data, and hopefully you will have that file by this point. So I'm gonna grade that line out, and you can even, yeah, we're gonna grade that line out. So in this case we are working already with a file that contains information, right? So I can look into this file. This is the point CSV file, and it contains information, it's not empty. Again, we're gonna minimize that. So right now we can actually go through the data and use the data for creating the points. Before we were creating them with just information that we were coming up with. We were just building up that information from scratch, but now we are like, we want to load that information, whatever that is. So the first thing would be a for loop, right? So for integer I equals 0, I is smaller than, here we're going to put data.length, right? So as big as that file is, read it. So this is what we're going to do, right? So at this point, data, it's going to give me, it's an array that contains lines of text. Each line of text would represent an entity, okay? The problem is that each line of text, in our case, let's say this is an entity, the next one is the second entity of the array, the third one is the third entity of the array. So let's check that if that is actually correct. So we could say something like, just to check, print line data 0. That means that it's an array, like a square bracket, right? And it also means that we want to print the first element of that array. If we run the script right now, right, we're having, yeah, obviously we're having a problem here because we're trying to run points that don't exist yet. So I'm going to grade that out for now. Right. Right. So this is what I was interested in. This print line imprinted 0, 0, comma, and some value instead, right? So just one entity contains 3 values. We need a way of actually splitting those values, each one of them, into different fields in order to make our variables, let's say x, y, and z. So that was just like a proof of what is actually being loaded. And if we would put that print line data and an I here, we would be able to see each one of the values that we are kind of getting out of that file, right? You could say print line data I, and it will print basically the whole file here, right? So that's, no, we're not going to do that, but let's do the second step of the script where we make another string array, right? This one will be called fields, meaning that we want to break each one of the entities here, 1, 2, and 3. I mean, if we had text file with more entities, still it would get broken first as each line, and then we could split it into each entity. So the way we do that is using a function called split, where we're gonna specify what do we want to split. Data, the element I. So we want to split every element in the array. And we need to specify, split works this way. We give a text and we say split it into different strings whenever you find some character, some specific character. In this case, we know that the comma is the character that is separating these fields, right? So this is one entity 0, comma, this is the second entity, comma, this is the third entity, right? So we're gonna say here, and notice that we're using a different quotation mark for character instead of this kind of quotation mark that we use for string, to specify the character that we will use as breakpoints. As I said, later data, this is very useful for later data, and later data comes with a space as a modulator for each field. So you can also specify space, right? In that case, space modulates different fields. You can use anything, really. So this is the way we are splitting it, right? And this field array will give us 3 values. So we could say float x equals fields 0. The first entity of this array, that one, would be our float x. The second entity would be y, and this will be 1. So as the arrays start with the entity 0, then the entity 1, and eventually the entity 2, that is the last one that we have, right? We will have our variables x, y, and z. And that's actually the information that we needed to, as we did before, to create our points, right? We generate a vector with x, y, and z, and then we position that, we create a new point in that vector for our grid. So we would copy a little bit of this code here, where we'll say create a new vector 3D. There's a point location where we would say x, comma, y, comma, z. Right? And what we would do now, we're gonna say, in this case, this will be a little bit tricky, I would say, because what we were doing before, it's build a grid, right? And the grid was based on columns and rows. Now we don't have J, we don't have the rows, we have just columns, right? We know that the points anyway will be like distributed in a grid fashion, right? But this won't work the same way. So for that, we will, for now actually, we will remove this J here. We're gonna say we're gonna have just one field. Well, actually, let's do it that way. I'm gonna explain a way of actually building a 2-dimensional array out of one loop. Right, so let's say J, right? We don't have a J or an I. So what do we need in order to use as a placeholder here to start building our own grid? We need a counter. We need to count both in X and in Y. So for that I'm going to do a variable here called integer count X equals 0 and integer count Y equals 0, right? So this will be my internal counters. I'm gonna start positioning points in a grid fashion, and eventually when I reach the end of a column, I would jump to the next one, and so forth, right? So we're gonna say the following. After creating a point, we're gonna say count X plus plus, right? So every frame we're counting 1. On top of that, if count X is bigger than calls, is that our variable? Yes. If it's bigger than our how many columns that we will have, what happens? Count Y plus plus and count X equals 0. This is kind of a typewriter statement. What are we saying? Here we go. We're saying count, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you get to 20, if count X is bigger than, if you reach 20, you count Y becomes 1 and count X becomes 0 again. So you go to the next row and so forth, and you keep going down. What is important is that we need to know how many columns and how many rows this data structure. I mean, whatever we're bringing in, if this is what we want to do, we would need to know how many columns and how many rows. As I said before, the later data provides that information. It would say there are 500 columns and 500 rows. Right? So use that information in order not to have an error here, right? And what we will put here, instead of I and j that before was our counter as part of the loop, we're going to use count X and count Y. So it's not I and j before were placeholders to build that grid, but now we're building those values ourselves, as the for loop here is just one big for loop through all the data, and we're kind of rebuilding the same structure that we had before, right? So we are creating for each one of these entities a new point in the position of XYZ of the splitted data fields. Now we can actually turn that on. Right. What is saying this error here? It's saying we cannot convert a string to a float, right? Because the field is still a string, and we are kind of making a float variable with that first entity, right? So what we need to do at this point is say float, right? So we use a function that is called float to convert a string into a float. This way, the information would get converted accordingly. So let's see. We're getting another problem here. Index out of bounds. This is saying we're trying to create a point that is bigger than, we're trying to get even further of what this data I suggested. Perhaps the data that we were creating, let's look at our file, and this file has 400, you probably can't see it there, but if I bring it down, 400 units, so it is 20 by 20. Alright, this is the problem. We should have put here equals columns. It's not bigger. I mean, in this way we're saying do 20 entities and not just 21. We were doing more entities than what the data really had. So let's see now. Right, so now it works. So now we have brought in to processing this information that comes from the text file. As I said, like usually if you load some later data, that it comes in a very strange format, but you can just write it as txt file. You can read txt files in several different formats here. And you will see a vast collection of points and really high resolution, and it's a really neat way to really see some file and say, hey, I want to see in processing what file is containing, you know. And I'm going to just use this splitting function to kind of see how that file is structured and eventually break it down and make my point cloud out of that. So with this we have both systems to importing points and exporting the points as well. Some people have asked me online how to do some exporting to Rhino. For a long time I have been working with exporting like point clouds with extra information. Let's say if we're working with agents or anything with velocity, some of that information I exported as well, so in order to just do some VB scripts that could read that information and use it for some design purpose. Lately we will see this in these tutorials as well. We can actually, like by using Toxic Clips, we can actually export meshes directly. So that's pretty neat if we want to produce a model or even an STL in processing. We can export it directly to other software like Rhino or Maya, where we can render them and stuff. So we're gonna see some of that eventually. For now, point clouds. That's it.